Scottish blood is not what you think it is, and by the end of this video, you will understand why geneticists call it one of the strangest bloodlines left in Europe. Before we get into it, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear about hidden tribes, forgotten invaders, and genes that should not still exist is going to change how you see an entire nation. For years we were told the story was simple. Scots are Celts, maybe with a splash of Viking blood thrown in for flavor. That story is dead. New DNA evidence pulled from bones buried under peat bogs and ancient stone cairns has blown that comfortable version of history apart. Inside those bones are fragments of a forgotten world, dark-skinned hunters who arrived after the ice melted, metalworking outsiders from the Bronze Age, ghost tribes known as the Picts, and strands of ancestry that trace all the way back to Syria, North Africa, and the frozen steppes of the Arctic. Some of these genes have no business surviving this long, yet they have survived quietly on remote Scottish islands, in narrow glens, and inside small fishing villages, passed down without interruption for more than 10,000 years. This is a story about who disappeared from the history books, but never disappeared from the blood. So how did Scottish DNA dodge the genetic waves that reshaped the rest of Europe? And what does that stubborn survival actually tell us about where the Scots came from? Stay with me, because this gets stranger with every layer we peel back. Before we go further back in time, it helps to understand exactly how scientists even managed to read a story this old out of something as fragile as ancient bone. Modern ancient DNA extraction relies on tiny fragments of genetic material preserved inside the dense petrous bone at the base of the skull, a part of the body that protects DNA from degradation far better than almost any other bone in the body. Labs sequence these fragments and compare them against enormous modern reference databases, cross-referencing markers found in populations from Scandinavia, Iberia, the Mediterranean, and beyond, essentially building a map of movement out of raw chemistry. Contamination control alone can take up more lab time than the actual sequencing, since a single stray trace of modern DNA from a careless researcher can quietly ruin months of careful work on a sample that took years to recover. It is slow, expensive, and painstaking work, but it has already rewritten more of Scotland's early history in the last 15 years than centuries of traditional archaeology managed on its own. Long before there were clans, tartans, or Celtic legends, Scotland was simply not survivable. Around 12,000 years ago, right at the tail end of the last ice age, thick sheets of ice covered nearly the entire landmass. There was nothing there, no forests, no people, just frozen rock and the constant grinding roar of glaciers carving out the deep valleys we now call glens. But ice does not stay forever. As the great sheets pulled back, the land slowly came back to life. Forests pushed north from the south, rivers swelled with meltwater, herds of game returned to graze, and following those herds came the very first humans to ever set foot on Scottish soil. These were small bands of hunter-gatherers drifting up from continental Europe, chasing fish and game into completely new territory. They were not Celtic, and they did not look anything like the image most people carry in their heads when they picture a Scot. Genetic reconstruction work suggests these earliest settlers had dark skin, striking blue eyes, and dark curly hair, an appearance that would turn heads today but was actually common across Western Europe during that period, known to scientists as the Mesolithic era. They lived scattered in small family groups, mostly hugging rivers and coastlines, fishing the waters, hunting red deer and wild boar, and shaping flint blades and bone tools by hand. Excavated camps at sites in places like Crowden and elsewhere have given archaeologists physical traces of their daily lives, but it was DNA extraction, not stone tools, that finally brought these people back into focus as real, breathing individuals rather than vague shadows in a textbook. Isotope analysis on their bones has even revealed details about their diet, showing heavy reliance on shellfish, salmon, and wild game, a coastal lifestyle that explains why so many of their camps cluster along river mouths and sheltered bays. Their tools were simple but effective, and the fact that similar flint working techniques appear from the Northern Isles all the way down to the southern coastline suggests these small bands stayed loosely connected, trading knowledge and perhaps even partners across surprising distances despite their small numbers. Even their toolmaking shows regional variation. Researchers can now map almost like a dialect, subtle differences in how a blade was struck or a scraper was shaped that hint at loosely connected but genuinely distinct family networks spread out across the early landscape. What genuinely stunned scientists was not simply that this ancient DNA had survived at all, it was where it had survived. Remote highland glens and islands scattered across the Hebrides still carry measurable traces of these original lineages today. The genetic markers are rare, admittedly, but the fact they persist at all tells us something remarkable about isolation. In these cut-off, hard-to-reach corners of Scotland, the genes of the very first settlers were never fully erased by the passage of time. They were preserved almost like fossils locked inside living blood. Scientists call this process genetic drift, And in Scotland, it was dramatically amplified by the landscape itself. Steep hills, dangerous coastlines, and scattered islands acted like natural vaults, sealing off small communities that ended up breeding largely among themselves for generation after generation. While major cities across the rest of Europe absorbed wave after wave of invasion, conquest, and intermarriage, certain corners of Scotland simply stayed out of reach. This is one of the biggest reasons Scottish DNA, particularly in the Highlands and the Islands, still carries genetic fingerprints belonging to people who walked that land more than 10,000 years ago. But this is only the opening chapter. As centuries passed, entirely new waves of settlers would eventually crash into these ancient bloodlines. Some blended smoothly, some buried the older lineages almost entirely, and some left behind nothing more than a faint genetic echo. Roughly 4,500 years ago, an enormous shift rippled across prehistoric Scotland. And it did not arrive through war or natural disaster. It arrived through people carrying pottery. Archaeologists gave these newcomers the name beaker folk, taken from the distinctive bell-shaped ceramic vessels they left scattered across their settlements. But it was never really the pottery that changed Scotland. It was their genes. These migrants most likely originated somewhere in Central Europe, in regions we would today call the Netherlands, northern France, and Germany. They brought with them metal tools, unfamiliar farming methods, and burial customs that were completely foreign to Scotland's native hunter-gatherer population. Most importantly of all, they carried a strikingly different genetic profile. Within just a handful of centuries, the Beaker people did far more than influence local culture. They effectively rewrote the gene pool. Genetic studies now show that these newcomers replaced up to 90% of the male lineage across Britain, Scotland, fully included. That means the bloodlines of countless Mesolithic men simply came to an end while Beaker ancestry surged forward to dominate. This was not some sudden act of genocide, though. It played out as a slow, uneven process of blending, intermarriage, and gradual cultural adoption. And in isolated pockets like the Highlands and the Hebrides, fragments of the older genetic lines still managed to survive underneath the new dominant layer. Scotland had become a land of dual inheritance, part Ice Age survivor, part continental newcomer, woven together into something entirely new. Burial customs shifted dramatically during this period too. Where the old hunter-gatherer dead were often laid simply into the earth, the Beaker newcomers introduced individual burial mounds with the deceased curled on their side and surrounded by pottery, tools, and sometimes early copper ornaments. Archaeologists can often tell a Beaker grave apart from an older burial at a glance, long before any DNA test confirms the difference. It's simply because the entire ritual around death had changed so completely in such a short span of time. Some of these mounds also contained early bronze daggers and gold ornaments, items that would have taken real skill and trade connections to produce, hinting that status and hierarchy were beginning to matter in ways the earlier, more egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands had never really needed to worry about. This shift toward visible wealth and rank inside individual graves marks one of the clearest turning points in the entire prehistoric record, a signal that Scottish society was beginning to organize itself around inherited status rather than pure survival for the very first time. Alongside the Beaker people came the Bronze Age, and with it, the first real signs of organized tribal society. Farming expanded across the landscape. Permanent settlements began to appear, and long-distance trade routes formed, linking Scotland to distant corners of Europe for the first time. Society grew more structured, but that same structure also made it more vulnerable to outside pressure and influence. Language began to shift as well. Early Celtic dialects started making their way into the region, likely carried in through some combination of further migration and simple cultural diffusion. These were not yet the Celts of modern myth and legend, but the linguistic seeds had unmistakably been planted in the soil. The entire landscape was changing, and along with it, the very identity of the people living on it. And out of this slow evolutionary churn, something entirely new began to take shape in the north. They carved strange, cryptic symbols into standing stones. They terrified Roman soldiers sent to subdue them. They fought fierce, prolonged wars without ever leaving behind a single written record of their own. They were called the Picts, and they would go on to become one of the most misunderstood peoples in all of European history. For centuries, the only accounts we had of the Picts came from their enemies. Roman writers labeled them the Picti, meaning the painted ones, describing them as fierce, wild, and utterly impossible to fully conquer. These northern warriors never built sprawling empires or wrote their own history books, but they left behind haunting carved stones, warrior burial grounds, and a fearsome reputation that still echoes down through time. They fought from the shadows, defying Roman occupation from territory lying beyond the rivers Forth and Clyde. Yet for all the impact they clearly had, the Picts seemed to simply vanish from the record by around the 9th century, leaving historians to puzzle over who they really were and where exactly they had gone. Modern DNA analysis is finally filling in those blanks. Recent studies, drawing on ancient burial sites in places across the Scottish Highlands and in Fife, have revealed that the Picts were never some mysterious wave of foreign invaders at all. Their genetic signatures line up closely with Iron Age populations that had already been living in Scotland for centuries beforehand. In other words, the Picts were locals, descendants of the very same people who had already blended Mesolithic and beaker blood together generations earlier. The Picts never truly vanished, they simply merged into the population around them. As Gaelic culture rose to prominence in the West, the Picts gradually adopted its language, its customs, and even its naming traditions. They were absorbed into the wider culture, but never completely erased from it. What makes this especially remarkable is that modern Highland Scots still carry measurable traces of this exact lineage today. Their DNA is not simply Scottish, in a very real sense, it is Pictish. And in remote areas long isolated by mountains and sea, these bloodlines have remained surprisingly intact right up to the present day. So the next time you hear someone from the far north speak proudly of their roots, remember they may well be carrying genes that were once quite literally worn like war paint into battle. Their famous symbol stones remain one of the most puzzling written systems in European archaeology, carved with animals. They're mirrors, combs, and abstract shapes that no one has ever fully decoded. Some historians believe these carvings recorded marriages, alliances, or territorial claims between different Pictish kingdoms. But without a translated written language to compare them against, the meaning stays locked away, guarded by stone that has already outlasted every empire that tried to erase the people who carved it. But Scotland's DNA story does not end with tribal warriors and hillside carvings, because while the Picts held firm in the north, entirely new forces were beginning to arrive from the south, wearing sandals, building roads, and carrying bloodlines from lands the native Scots had never even heard of, let alone seen. By the time the Picts were raising their carved stones in the north, an ambitious new empire was rising far to the south. The Romans, relentless and endlessly organized, had pushed their way to the very fringes of Scotland by the 1st century of the Common Era. They called this untamed land Caledonia, a place of wild terrain and even wilder tribes, and despite their best efforts, they never truly managed to conquer it. Instead, the Romans built forts, watchtowers, and roads, with Hadrian's Wall eventually marking the effective northern limit of Roman Britain, while frontier outposts kept an uneasy, fragile peace along the very edge of the empire. Rome may not have dominated Scotland militarily, but it still left behind a lasting genetic footprint. The soldiers stationed in those legions were never purely Italian. Recruits arrived from every corner of the empire, including Spain, Syria, and North Africa, and many spent years stationed in Britain's rugged borderlands. Some of these men formed lasting relationships with local women, and although Rome's overall presence in Scotland was relatively brief, faint traces of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern ancestry still linger quietly in parts of southern Scotland to this day. These are not dominant strands of ancestry by any means, and researchers still debate exactly how significant the numbers really are, but certain family lines in the lowlands do show hints of foreign genetic markers that could realistically only have arrived through these far-flung Roman recruits. This means that even without ever achieving full conquest, the Roman Empire still managed to inject small threads of genuinely global ancestry into the Scottish gene pool, a quiet echo of an empire that once stretched from the sands of Africa all the way to the misty moors of northern Britain. Trade goods tell a similar story to the bones themselves. Pottery, glassware, and coins minted thousands of miles away have all turned up at frontier forts. Proof that soldiers stationed on this cold northern edge of the empire kept receiving supplies, letters, and news from home no matter how far they had been posted. Some of these men clearly never left once their service ended, choosing instead to settle permanently near the fort where they had spent years of their lives, marrying into local families, and quietly folding their distant ancestry into the surrounding population for good. And once Rome eventually withdrew from the region, a new group of seafarers wasted absolutely no time filling the resulting power vacuum. They did not arrive marching in disciplined columns or building stone walls. They arrived in long wooden ships carrying blades and fire, and the genetic mark they left behind would prove to be far louder than anything Rome ever managed. In the late 8th century, the relative quiet of Scotland's northern coastline was suddenly shattered by the arrival of Viking longships. These raiders were not simply hit-and-run attackers. They were settlers with long-term intentions. And over the following 2 centuries, Norse people would leave a permanent, unmistakable genetic stamp across the Scottish islands. The Orkney and Shetland Island groups in particular became powerful Viking strongholds. Unlike earlier invaders who came, fought, and left, the Norse settlers actually colonized these islands outright, taking local wives, farming the land themselves, and establishing their own Norse laws and customs in place of what came before. Modern genetic testing today reveals that up to 60% of male genetic lineages in Orkney trace directly back to Norse origin, an even higher percentage than you find in parts of Norway itself. That single statistic alone shows just how completely dominant Viking ancestry became across these particular islands. Even beyond Orkney and Shetland, Norse influence stretched further into the Hebrides and onto mainland Scotland, especially along coastal regions where regular trade and periodic conflict kept contact between the two cultures constant. But the genetic reach of the Vikings was never purely physical. It also laid much of the groundwork for the clan-based power structures that would come to define Scotland for centuries afterward. Later still, the Normans, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled generations earlier in northern France, arrived in Scotland not through axes and raids, but through strategic marriage and royal favor. They wove Norse, Breton, and Frankish bloodlines directly into the southern aristocracy, reshaping land ownership, clan naming conventions, and political power structures in the process. Familiar names like Bruce, Stuart, and Sinclair, names so deeply woven into modern Scottish identity, actually carry genetic footprints that trace back far beyond the Highlands themselves. These particular lineages, still fully traceable in lowland populations today, stand in sharp contrast to the far older, more isolated bloodlines still preserved further north. So while the Romans only ever brushed against the very edges of Scotland, the Vikings dug their roots in deep, especially in the north, where Norse blood still quietly shapes faces, family names, and even the names of entire places on the map today. Walk across the Northern Isles today and you will notice it immediately in the place names themselves. Villages ending in the Old Norse suffixes for farm, bay, or fjord. A linguistic fossil record sitting right on top of the genetic one. Even the Old Norse language itself, known locally as Norn, survived as a spoken tongue in Orkney and Shetland for centuries after the rest of Scotland had shifted to Scots and Gaelic, only fading out of daily use relatively recently in historical terms. But as Scotland absorbed all these outside influences, something genuinely surprising was also happening internally. The clan system, long assumed to represent tightly knit biological families, turns out to have been something considerably more complicated. For generations, the Scottish clan system was treated almost like a living family tree, a genealogical record stretching back through the centuries. Names like MacDonald, MacLeod, and Campbell echoed through Scottish history, tied firmly to legendary ancestors, famous battlefields, and sacred ancestral lands. But modern DNA analysis has revealed something that genuinely rewrites this proud old tradition. Genetic testing shows that many clans were never truly biological families at all, but were instead something closer to social alliances or protective networks. Within some of the largest clans, such as the MacDonalds, dozens of completely unrelated male lineages share the exact same surname, which strongly suggests that people simply adopted a powerful clan name for protection, political allegiance, or access to land, rather than because they actually shared any real ancestry. By striking contrast, clans like the Campbells show a much tighter genetic pattern, with the overwhelming majority of men sharing the very same Y chromosome lineage, strongly suggesting a genuine single paternal founder at the root of the clan. These particular clans functioned more like true dynasties, expanding steadily outward from one powerful founding ancestor across many successive generations. In countless other cases, though, belonging to a clan was really about social belonging rather than actual biology. Following major battles or sudden political upheavals, entire families would adopt the surname of whichever clan currently held power, purely as a matter of survival or social status. Over time, these surnames effectively became political banners rather than genuine bloodlines. Yet even amid all this social complexity, Scotland's rugged geography kept right on shaping its underlying gene pool. The Highlands and the Outer Islands, thanks to their sheer remoteness, functioned almost like natural genetic time capsules. Communities living on islands, such as Islay and Lewis, have retained distinct DNA markers found nowhere else on Earth, not even elsewhere on mainland Scotland. On Lewis in particular, researchers have documented a genetic signature so distinct that it barely overlaps with populations found just a short ferry ride away on the mainland, a gap that would normally take total physical separation across an ocean to produce, not a few miles of open water. Skye occupies an interesting middle ground in this pattern, close enough to the mainland to have absorbed more outside blood over the centuries, yet still remote enough that certain older lineages persist in its more isolated crofting townships. A reminder that isolation in Scotland was never absolute, just uneven, with pockets of near total preservation sitting only a short distance from pockets of heavy mixing. Ferry routes, road access, and even something as simple as which direction the prevailing winds blow have all quietly shaped which communities stayed sealed off and which ones opened up to newcomers, meaning the genetic map of Scotland today is really a map of geography and infrastructure just as much as it is a map of history. Shetland tells a similar story from a different angle. where centuries of Norse dominance layered so thickly over the older population that even today islanders sometimes joke that they feel more culturally tied to Bergen than to Edinburgh. And the genetics back that feeling up more than most people realize. This particular level of regional genetic uniqueness is genuinely rare anywhere in Europe. Centuries of ordinary migration and warfare usually mix populations together fairly thoroughly over time. But in Scotland, the mountains, the lochs, and the surrounding seas isolated communities just enough to preserve genetic fragments dating all the way back to the Mesolithic period, the Bronze Age, and the Viking era, all layered together inside a single population. As geneticists now turn their attention towards Scotland's own royal bloodlines, the mystery only continues to deepen. Genetic traces linked to historical figures, such as Robert the Bruce or Mary Queen of Scots, have hinted at possible hereditary medical conditions that researchers are only now beginning to properly investigate. Some of this royal genetic research has even reached into unmarked graves and disputed burial sites, using DNA comparison to settle centuries-old arguments about which bones actually belong to which historical figure, turning genetics into a kind of forensic detective work layered directly on top of medieval history. So even if the clan name you claim today does not perfectly match your actual DNA, the genes you personally carry still tell a genuinely remarkable story, one built entirely out of migration, adaptation, and stubborn survival right at the edge of Europe. Researchers studying these clan lineages often rely on Y chromosome testing specifically, since that particular piece of DNA passes almost unchanged from father to son across dozens of generations, acting like a surname written directly into the biology itself. When a supposed clan brotherhood turns out to contain a dozen unrelated genetic signatures, it does not diminish the clan's history so much as reveal what that history actually was, an alliance of convenience and loyalty rather than a strict bloodline, which in some ways makes the survival of the clan identity even more impressive. Today you will find Scottish genetic ancestry scattered across places where bagpipes have never once been played and heather has never bloomed. From the open plains of Canada to the coastlines of New Zealand, from the Appalachian Mountains to the vast Australian outback, millions of people alive right now carry fragments of Scottish DNA, often without even realizing it. This massive genetic export happened in distinct historical waves. The Highland clearances, large-scale colonial migration, devastating famine, and repeated wars all pushed Scots abroad by the thousands over the centuries. Many of these immigrants carried genuinely ancient DNA with them, from Bronze Age clans, Norse settlers, or Mesolithic foragers, quietly embedding those ancient bloodlines directly into the founding populations of entirely new nations overseas. What genuinely surprises most people today is just how specific these genetic links can actually be. Modern DNA testing can now trace someone's ancestry not just back to Scotland in a general sense, but to specific individual islands or tightly defined regions, places like Skye, Orkney, Argyll, or Lewis. These particular locations were once so genetically distinct from their neighbors that their unique markers still clearly stand out even after crossing oceans and passing through several centuries of dilution. And while the wider world kept changing rapidly around them, certain corners of Scotland simply refused to change at the same pace. The Highlands and the Outer Isles remain genuine living time capsules, preserving genetic combinations that have become virtually extinct everywhere else across Europe. Traits once carried by Ice Age hunters or wandering Bronze Age settlers still live on quietly in the blood of island fishermen, Highland craftspeople, and the descendants of immigrants who carried their family stories with them wherever they eventually settled. Even genuinely rare genetic markers originally traced back to North Africa, the Middle East, or the far reaches of Siberia still occasionally turn up inside modern Scottish DNA test results. Whether these markers first arrived with Roman legionaries, Viking explorers, or medieval traders moving along ancient routes, they all serve as a quiet reminder that no land, however remote it might appear on a map, has ever truly existed in complete isolation, not in spirit, and certainly not in its genes. Entire regions overseas still carry the unmistakable fingerprint of this exodus, from the Gaelic-speaking communities that held on for generations in parts of Canada, to the Scots-Irish settlers who carried their bloodlines into the American frontier and shaped entire dialects and musical traditions that still echo distinctly Scottish rhythms today. Genealogists tracing these overseas family trees frequently find themselves led straight back to a single remote glen or a single small island, proof that even after crossing an ocean and living apart for centuries, the genetic thread back to that original patch of Scottish soil rarely breaks completely. In Nova Scotia specifically, whole communities kept Gaelic alive as a working, everyday language well into the 20th century, long after it had faded from daily use across much of the Scottish mainland itself, an accident of geography that turned a corner of eastern Canada into an unlikely time capsule for a language many assumed was already dying back home. Australia and New Zealand tell a slightly different version of the same story, where Scottish surnames cluster heavily in mining and farming regions settled during the 19th century, and where local historical societies still trace family lines back through parish records to specific Highland estates cleared during that same painful era of forced displacement. Scotland's DNA has never been a single clean thread running neatly through history. It is closer to a tapestry, stitched together out of stone, bone, and fire across more than 10,000 years of continuous human presence. It has been physically shaped by unforgiving landscape, quietly preserved by centuries of hardship and isolation, and ultimately carried across entire continents by people who never truly stopped calling that windswept northern land home, no matter how far they eventually traveled from it. If this journey through deep time, ancient stone, and tangled bloodlines gave you a completely new way of looking at Scotland's long and complicated past, make sure you hit that subscribe button before you go, because we uncover stories exactly like this one all the time, hidden histories your own DNA might still be quietly carrying inside it. We are constantly digging into ancient migrations, lost tribes, and genetic footprints etched permanently into the historical record, and we would genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Has a DNA test ever revealed a connection you truly did not expect? A long forgotten region? A mysterious ancient lineage? Or perhaps even a Scottish clan you never realized you were actually connected to all along? Every single person carrying even a trace of Scottish ancestry today, whether they grew up on a croft in the Outer Hebrides or in a suburb thousands of miles away with no obvious connection left at all, is quietly walking around with a piece of that 10,000-year record still written into their cells. The hunters who followed the retreating ice, the potters who arrived with new metal and new customs, the warriors who painted themselves before battle, the soldiers who marched up from the edges of a distant empire, the raiders who became settlers and eventually became neighbors. All of it is still in there, layered quietly on top of itself, waiting for anyone curious enough to go looking. That is really the whole point of a story like this one. History does not just live in old books sitting on a shelf somewhere gathering dust. It lives inside us, inherited without our permission or our awareness, carried forward through births and marriages and long journeys across oceans that none of us personally chose to make, but all of us still carry the consequences of. Scotland, more than almost anywhere else in Europe, happens to be a place where that inheritance stayed unusually visible, protected by mountains, by cold seas, and by sheer geographic stubbornness, long enough for modern science to finally catch up and read it properly.